Hello, my name is Valeria Armendariz, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on Historians of the Future, or my final project, about how I think historians will see this era that we currently live in right now, 50 years to 100 years in the future. So starting off is the era we live in right now. Basically, how I'm describing it is starting in the early 2000s, and I think since the beginning of the 2000s really changed how people were living in the 19th century, from what I've heard. Basically, like we're basically known as the information era, so and the technological era, kind of like that. Things are very important because technology was given big rise during the 2000s, where we basically see the integration of children now growing up with this technology compared to 90s kids. Like, for example, I was born in 2004, and I just remember some sort of technology being around as compared to kids that I grew up in the 90s didn't have that. So I think this is where that era really like has a difference and why I will define it this way. And as well as major events like politically and like modern society that are also very different and how I think people will look back when they see this. So then starting off with my first one, kind of like the political sphere stuff. So basically how I think one of the main things that I think will be talked about a lot here is the 2024 presidential election. I think this one is one of the big ones. Like I know there was a lot of big ones like the 2016 election or the 2008, 2009 election. That was also very much a big one for the 2020 election as well. But I think the 2024 presidential election will be much talked about just because it was Donald Trump and Kamala Harris being fighting against each other. Also, just the circumstances of the election, kind of like how we see the step down of the presidential candidate and his vice president stepping up to it, which is also very big because we rarely see female candidates for presidency coming into place. And Kamala was one of the big ones because she was like our first female vice president as well as being a non-Caucasian female vice president as well. So I think that was pretty big to see her coming up to the stand because she was in white, as well as like she's going up against Donald Trump, who was a former presidential candidate, as well as her last term where she served as vice president was where he fought against. And it was just seeing, I think it was pretty impactful seeing that all play out, how everyone got really like, what's it called? Passionate about it, how we see both sides really fighting towards the candidate that they want, and how we see like with voting and everything in there, how we see a difference between it, like your blue states still being blue, red states still being red, but how we see the swing states kind of leaning towards, depending on where they were, blue or red, or we kind of see how Texas in a way getting a little bit more liberal leading up to this, but it's still red overall, just because of counties, but big cities are still blue as we see. Um, so I think that one's going to be very much talked about when we look back on it, just because just the circumstances leading up to it. And then I also will be talking about immigration as well. I think kind of like we talked about in this class, immigration was a big part in the beginning of the 1890s to the 1920s, and basically just how our society has been functioning without it or with it. So I'm seeing like with the resurgence of immigration coming, not the resurgence, but like basically how many Latin Americans or any other country coming in with a lot of immigrants, and then just the surge of it and how we're dealing with it and how that whole conversation's going. I think that's going to be very important, mainly because like there was many problems along the border with um, immigrants coming in because I'm from El Paso. So basically, we're seeing a lot of like immigration there. There's a lot of homelessness population growing, as well as just like racism also very much in the surge again, like how we saw about in class, where people were very much like discriminating against them. How ICE is now encouraged to be um, targeting people, which is basically racial profiling that's coming up again. Being so if you look like you're Hispanic, then people will assume that you're probably an immigrant. And just while seeing like ICE raids happening a lot more, the whole allowing of that ICE agents are able to cover their face, they don't need to show their ID number or anything to identify themselves. They're just able to take people and then put them through, I guess, like cases. I worked with ICE patients and I've heard stories from them. There was one ICE patient that I got to hear about. He was from Venezuela. He was a chemical engineer sent to the United States, like Virginia, I think, to be able to, talk about it, or not talk about it, to be able to work. And he was basically caught without documentation and was put through that whole process, which I think would be very important because we have people who are here legally being arrested and being put through the whole process behind like immigration and to be able to be deported back when they shouldn't need to be. So I think this would be very important when we talk back to it, just how, this was allowed, the United States is allowing, everything to happen with immigration as well as with like, how we said last, how President Donald Trump, before in his 2016 to 2020 term, there was big talks about building a wall and expanding it, making it taller, making it harder, making border patrol like higher and all that. I think that's going to be very important to talk about since we did see that a lot back to, so we could call back to like how we saw before with the first like immigrations coming in, because like everything in history we see as a callback to something else. So we know that, oh, this happened, so we're seeing another thing happen because of it. So I think this is going to be one of those things where we're seeing like immigration happening again and how we're dealing with it now with these new resources, as well as the treatment of camps that we're seeing, just because of how many camps that are opening up, resources being put into it, and it's like the cruelty behind it or like the treatment behind these people. It's not necessarily the best, and I think something that will be called back as something that doesn't need to happen again, or just better policy making within immigration as well as like call back to other countries and how they're dealing with it, because like why is the immigration happening? So I know specifically for Latin American countries, Mexico's border on the southern end is not necessarily the greatest. The president wasn't doing a very good job. Well, not good job. Um, necessarily like documentation allowing who can come in. So a lot of people came into Mexico, and because of that, they were able to migrate to the United States, and then from there, it's just kind of like you see a large amount of South Americans coming in as well as just like the treatment towards them, the refugee camps and all that. Basically how they were able to go through that and like how the needs that they're getting through, so the lives that going up this were letting them through, or just like people organizing this happens. So it's just kind of things like that. And as well as like just crime and border, as well as in the border cities, especially being from Texas. I think that's a very big thing that needs to be talked about as well, especially in Texas history in the United States. We can kind of see how that's like coming into play and how many families are still coming in, and you just the importance of immigration and how like they're still the backbone of our society. Kind of like the way how in the 1920s people were taking factory jobs. It's the same way that how like many we see immigrants coming here and taking like agricultural jobs, farming jobs, just all that. So I think that would be very big. It's still a main topic that we'll see in the future, and I hope it's like not necessarily erased or rewritten in a way, because this is I think very important. I'm kind of very passionate about it. Modern society as well. I would talk about like mainly mass shootings in the United States. I think would be called them, just because how usually in history we learn about war and how that's where firearms are really used. But I think now in the United States we're seeing how mass shootings have become a much more popularized sensation, and how people are just like seeing a lot more of this happen, especially. Mainly this has happened before, but in the 2000s, as we're seeing, it's almost like happening every single day or multiple at a day, depending on how people define mass shootings. But there's always some sort of call, warning, or someone walking around with an open arm. Very much. The first one that I see was in 1966 in the University of Texas in Austin. This was like the first main one where people were killed and injured. But as we could see, that kind of was like a slow start, because then we had very big ones coming up after that. But then now in the 2000s, we're seeing a lot more just of this happening every day. We're seeing like schools, stores, or public areas getting targeted by people with usually minimal injury. But there's some pretty big ones happen as well. Like I was reading a database and how people were, we'll see like there'll be 3 or 4 injured, maybe one dead someday, and it's usually like every single day there's a different one in a different part of the United States. There was one that had like 27 injured, but 0 people killed at like some store in like being Chicago or somewhere like that. I don't remember exactly, but I think this is going to be talked about by historians in the future, basically on just how the Second Amendment right is being talked about, and about just gun control in general. Because there's already a big debate going on whether people should have guns or shouldn't have guns, and I think it would be kind of like effective for people as like we go on in the future, just seeing how basically our First Amendment right is being practiced, and how people, or not a First Amendment right, the Second Amendment right is being practiced and how people will get control to that. Kind of just like how callbacks to the Bill of Rights, how our First Amendment right can be kind of discussed about how like freedom of speech is kind of loose because there are limitations to our freedom of speech that we're able to give. So kind of in the same sense as we have the right to bear arms, but there's like a limit to how we can bear those arms, like how we can use them. And then just to call back to like different states, like Texas has open carry, you're able or concealed carry, yes, where you're able to hold it, but you're not able, you don't have to show it. In some cases, you don't need a license to hold it while you're holding it. It's very easy to get with them, and I think it'll be very interesting on how we go look back to it and how gun control comes in the future as well. And just how like the whole discussion about how like teachers, the whole debate as well, like how teachers should be trained to use guns in schools, and how some people agree that they don't need this training, there just needs to be gun control behind it. I think this is kind of like an important thing as well, especially how we're trying to lower all these shootings happening because just people are getting scared. We're saying like the public outcry to like how children in school have to be taught how to be hide whenever there's an active shooter on campus. And it's just as well as like hearing stories about how people, it's a common fear people have about going outside. And just kind of would be interesting to see how historians will be able to say about that. I think there will be different sides, more conservative of how we do have the right to bear arms, but then we just need to ban them from certain cases, or use cases of like ban all guns altogether to be able to provide stop this. But then again, it's kind of like that whole thing of like, oh, we need to there will still be violence against guns. It's just how we go about it and how we're able to minimize that. Or then, like, just to talk about like mental health and how people who are committing these crimes are, they need help and they need that extra support to be able to stop it before they get to the point where they do shootings as well. And then the kind of mass shootings can be defined in the sense of like people intent to kill, people intent to rob, and people getting like hurt in the case like that. Um, and just racism in general as well. Kind of like how the El Paso. I know there's like very much such in Texas, but like El Paso shooting is like I think one of the more recent mass shootings that we had about a man from Dallas who wrote a manifesto, who I think will be described in books or in history as like one of those like big mass shootings that happened or more infamous ones. How he went from Dallas, wrote a manifesto, drove all the way there to El Paso to a Walmart to where he shot and he killed 23 people and injured more. To where now on August 3rd, every single year El Paso commemorates and has like a vigil for those people who died. Um, so it will be kind of like one of those things where we remember that tragedy and how we need to be able to help the people who have that and just yeah. I think this is very important in how we see the future, how we go on, and just how guns in America are having this, especially the argument people bring up that this doesn't happen in other countries, so we should do more to be able to prevent it. So I hope in the future, like mass shootings do go down, and it would be pretty good debate to see from people. Women to the male gaze. I think this is kind of important. There's many ways I could go through this, but kind of just like in the talks, especially recently in the 2000s, women have been put in the spotlight a lot. And it just had throughout history as well, call back to it. Women have always been under the spotlight, sorry, of men in just everywhere. Where we have the thing called the male gaze, which I think has been very popularized recently, about how women's sexualization or objectification has been very prominent in the media. And I think it'll be something that, especially like gender studies, will look forward or look into a lot. Kind of like how neo-feminism, especially, has been labeled to feminists. So kind of the whole debate of like how we had feminism in the history, we're fighting for women, but now neo-feminism is being labeled to feminists, so it's just only for women instead of the equality of everyone, which is the whole movement of feminism, to be able to say that we want everyone to be equal. Kind of like how we saw in history, where now in the 21st century, we're seeing how feminism is being seen as women are better than men, which is not the point of feminism, but we're seeing that a lot being shown to feminists and their fight towards equality. There was like an interesting article I read about like just media and how women are portrayed in it, or showing the struggles of women through media. And there was an interesting documentary that was showing that women in the military often get assaulted and don't I'm so sorry, and don't get believed most of the time. So that is kind of like how still there's a power imbalance as we continue, even though there's been so much advancement in equality in women in the United States. We're still seeing kind of like that imbalance to where women in the military don't have the same like standing as men socially, and to where that they get assaulted often and are often not believed by the commander or like the officer in charge, just because of how they're seen as women, and it's kind of like a brotherhood, as I read in this, where it's like fathers are very prominent in taking care of their sons, or like brothers stick with each other, instead of treating everyone as equal. As like if a man got hurt, then they would like look into it more, while if a woman got raped, it would be very much like, oh, look over it, or it's okay because it's not real. Um, Kind of just heartbreaking, and basically, yeah, just how men in general in this generation have been looking at women as well. We see women in the media often being sexualized, women in TV shows having no real personality written to them, which as men are still very prominent in it, as well as like kind of, with men having to say in women's rights, coming back to the political sense of how Roe v. Wade was overturned, which is, I think, a very big thing historians will look at, because Roe v. Wade was one of those cases you learn about in your class. Now I think it could be something historians will look at and be like, Roe v. Wade was overturned. How will other Supreme Court cases be overturned in the future, or how can an old Supreme Court case be overturned, and kind of just having that question for students, especially in the future. I think that would be pretty interesting, seeing like how a really big case that was able to allow women to get abortions and like birth control and all that was able to be overturned like that, and now give power back to the states, which is one of those things where it was a big fight towards the federal government power and the state power, and how something so big was able to be given back to the states when it was seen that this was a protection for women in a federal sense. So where now we're having to look through means, and we can see in like other countries as well, like Romania, where it was illegal before then, just how many deaths it was having for women getting pregnancies that are unwanted. And so I think it's kind of like one of those things where women are still very much fighting for inequality with men, because like men are still doing these things and they're just not respecting women as they should be respected, as an equal, but instead more as an object. So I think that's still be kind of like how we're still in the same standing. Women are still able to go to school. We're at the position where women can be equal, but still not treated as equal. And I think that question will be posed as like, why is this still happening? Why is there like some conservatism still in militant society, even though it's the 21st century, and it's been like decades on decades of women fighting for this equality as well. Uh, just because it was a little bit negative, I wanted to see that there's going to be some achievements that I think will be highlighted from historians in this era as well. And I think a lot of it will be focused on women, just because how history goes. A marginalized group will have to fight for it to be able to be recognized, and I think women have been fighting for this for a very long time. So, like I said, we're going to be seeing as the first female vice president. I think Kamala Harris will be very much highlighted in this case, because she was first female vice president and female vice president who was of color. So I think that's very big for both the people of color and for the women community as well in the United States, and just kind of like someone for girls to look up to be able to go into government as well. We have two presidential candidates who are very big from major political parties, the Democrats, that were also in this era. What's it called? Hillary Clinton and Kamala Harris. Of course, there's controversy behind them, but I think it's very highlighted to be seen, kind of like the same way how we highlight very big figures in it. I think they will be highlighted as well as like presidential candidates as well, who are women, and just the fight towards like them becoming president, and just the fact that Hillary Clinton was a presidential candidate and her husband was Bill Clinton. So seeing like how they will be seen in history. Um, I think some other ones were I think were highlighted is Nobel Peace Prize winners Emmanuel Carpentier and Jennifer Doudna. They're more so something in the science world, which they're being highlighted right now as I learn about them, since they were made the CRISPR-Cas9, which is gene editing. But I think it'll be fine, kind of seeing how like women have been up on the rise in both the political sphere and the scientific sphere as well. Because most of the scientists that we do hear about with these big technological inventions, are men, but now we're seeing a lot more women being able to win Nobel Peace Prizes, creating science and all that, and just highlighting the fact that they're like very prominent in these fields and they do so much, and now they're getting the spotlight and the recognition that they deserve now in the 20th century, since they won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2020. Um, there are many women now in universities in many disciplines, so now we're seeing a lot more women in like many fields like engineering. Education is like female dominated, sciences like biology, chemistry, and then business as well. So we're seeing a lot more of that, which that equals thing where now men will be seeing like enrollment status of women around the same, and as well as women of color and people of color as well. So I think that's very important that people see that. And as well as the hashtag #MeToo movement, I think that will get a lot of recognition as well, just because sexual assault has been up on the rise and how we're able to recognize that from people in the today's society, how something so normalized, like going back to my last point, how male prominence has been always there, and just kind of how people don't believe women. And now with this movement, women have voices are being heard, and how their mistreatment is something that we're seeing get recognized, and just how we're getting people to believe, and then making it a more open sphere for people to talk about something so taboo, which we've seen not in history being something hidden, or that people would have to keep in themselves. These are my sources that I got like most of this information from, or just like other resources that I got like more perspective on from this to get an idea from it, and how I think there's already so much literature about a lot of these issues that I talk about today that I think more will keep getting written and more will keep getting discovered into where historians will be looking back on it, evaluating it, or teaching it to other people in the future as well. Thank you. That was a great presentation, and I hope you liked it.